we had this letter from Karandar in Los Angeles that Prabhupada's traveling and everyone should invite him to their temple. And Karandar said, of course he won't go, but it's the etiquette for the disciple to invite the guru to visit the temple. So I was absolutely sure that while Prabhupada might travel to Europe or something, 1 or 2 temples, he wasn't going to go around the world. What to speak of come to Australia? And so I wrote him the letter, the form letter. I put in every persuasive argument and every embellishment and said, we're just dying for you to come here, fully confident that that would never happen. And gosh, 2 or 3 weeks later, they said Prabhupada's in India, they're having a big program in Bombay at the Kosh Maidan, and that he wanted to come to Australia right afterwards. Please send tickets for 3 people. We were stunned. We never thought that Prabhupada would come to Australia. And as far as 3 tickets for 3 people, our income was $100 a week. Maybe that was a good week going out and selling back to guys. Where were we going to come up with $3,000? So we put like one of those thermometers on the board for fundraising. And lo and behold, there was a devotee there. And he came up to me one day and he said, I would like to facilitate Prabhupada's coming to Australia. I heard you need $3,000. And he just sold a house. So I got the tickets for Prabhupada and he came to Australia. He came with Bhagavan and Padmavati, who had just been married. And he came with the deities, Radha Gopinath, that had been used at that Kosh Maidan Pandal. Bhagavan sat on the plane with the deities in his lap.
There was a whole bunch of devotees that had joined recently. Some had just joined that week, 7 days ago, some just 2 days ago. But Prabhupada decided he was just going to initiate everybody. And when Prabhupada arrived, Bali Madan and Bhagavan were carrying Radha Krishna deities. So Srila Prabhupada obviously wanted that there were some Brahmins. So we got initiation. 5 of us got first and second initiation simultaneously. Of course, I didn't know what a Brahmin was. I hadn't a clue really what initiation meant, although I did understand about following certain principles and chanting rounds. But at some point someone announced, okay, we're going to have 5 Brahmins here, so you need Brahmin threads. And Bali Maridan took off a thread that he was wearing around him and said, make some of these. So I got up from the fire arena where I was sitting by the fire, ran out, went up and down the street looking for string. Something similar. I got as close as I could. And then I came back and sat by the fire again and was making these long string things with knots in them. Later on, somebody said, okay, now you're a Brahmin, so you have to wear a Brahmin thread too, so make one for yourself. And I said, what's a Brahmin? And I was confused, and then someone else said, ladies don't wear Brahmin threads. So that was going on, the initiation was going on, and the installation was also going on. We didn't know the deities were coming, really. When they came, we didn't know what to do. But in the year between the first visit and the second, we'd made a lot of progress. And we'd built a beautiful altar there. And that's when he said, when I was here before, I prayed to the Lord that he would instruct you from within how to take care of him, and he has done so. So he was very pleased with the deity worship by then. When he left the previous year, he was thinking we were very much malechas.
Well, because I was totally shy, I've always been shy. Being interviewed by those reporters, I think the only way I could have done that was because of my commitment to ISKCON and the devotees and Prabhupada. I wouldn't have normally left home, but I met the devotees and I just had to come and join the temple. There was a force that was way stronger than any of my personal qualities would prevent from happening. So I was very embarrassed. I was worried about my mother because she cried when I left home and she was upset. She didn't understand. From an early age I used to tell her I came from another planet. I was from outer space and she never really understood that. So it was difficult to explain why you're going with this weird sect and why you're bowing down on the dirty Paddington streets to some Indian person that we've never met before. So it was a scary time for me because I just turned 18. And I had no worldly experience, so I was totally going against society. totally going against my parents.
My thoughts have mellowed considerably since then. I now realise the Hare Krishna movement isn't the monster I thought it was. 30 years ago, I was frightened of what I didn't understand. I know many of my daughter's devotee friends, and I find them to be loving, warm people. I love my Hare Krishna grandsons, who have turned out to be normal, everyday boys. And she's come to no harm. In fact, she's a lovely girl, and I'm very proud of her.
But I had that strong conviction that I have to do this because Krishna was helping me. I know that sounds a bit sort of trite, but initially when I wanted to leave home, I thought, how am I going to leave home? So the very next day my mother said, when I was 17 I left home, so if you want to leave home it's okay. I thought, aha, Krishna's helping me. That real kind of connection with God was coming. You know, it's like that where you take one step towards God, he takes many steps towards you. So I could feel that. The first time I went to the temple, I was just totally overwhelmed with the prasadam, the smells. I thought, finally I'm home. So if I did anything in this life, I was going to stay there and I was going to do it because this was my ticket out of the material world, and this was the only place ever that I ever felt comfortable. So there was something special happening there due to Prabhupada's potency.
I met Kurandar just before the summer Rath Yatra in '71. He had come up to Portland to meet me and to tour the temple. And he told me about how important book distribution was. And so I was assigned the task of selling books. We had the hardbound books in Portland, and the idea we had at that time was to go to the bookstores, convince them to carry the books. And in those days, it was very easy to convince the bookstores to carry spiritual books. And then we drove down to San Francisco for the summer Rath Yatra. For many devotees, that was the first time they ever saw Srila Prabhupada. And it was the first time that I ever saw Srila Prabhupada. And everything I had been feeling from my own chanting and from hearing Prabhupada's bhajans became very magnified and intensified. Hundreds of devotees were crying, genuinely crying. That kirtan was a very special, ecstatic kirtan, a lot of mercy from Srila Prabhupada and Lord Jagannath that day. I was also very emotional. I was crying and very affected. I knew I was going to dedicate everything that I had to Srila Prabhupada.
So I'd been in the temple already a year and a half, and Prabhupada was coming. So I remember that Malati, Jyotirmayi, Mandakini, and myself, we stayed back. Everybody else went to the airport. And I was feeling really, really badly because all the other devotees that had already met Prabhupada were like on another platform, and they were so excited. And Mandakini, we had to do everything. It pushed me to the point where I was kind of feeling negative. So I was feeling really bad about myself. So Prabhupada came through the door into Berry Place, and Malati was first in line, then Jyotirmayi, I think, then Mandakini, and there was a temple door, and I hung back to the back. So Prabhupada walked in with a big smile on his face, and he gave a garland to Malati, he gave a garland to Jyotirmayi, he gave a garland to Mandakini, and then he turned to go into the temple room. So I thought, well, you know, this is right because I'm such a nonsense, you know, I don't deserve anything from Prabhupada. But I remember when he went into the temple room, it was kind of late in the evening. Prabhupada offered his obeisances, very deliberate and very slow and just very transcendental. And then he stood up and he just held his hands and just looked into the deities so nicely. And then he went upstairs, and then all the devotees got back from the airport. And we were all in a big room, and it was either Ekadasi or it was going past midnight and it was going to become Ekadasi. So Prabhupada was giving out sweets, and he gave them to each devotee, and I stood way in the back because I was feeling so badly, you know, and he was just kind of, He kind of forced me to come. It was like, I didn't feel right coming up, but he forced me with his hand and put it in my hand like that, kind of smiled and dropped it in my hand. And then there was some talk about, it's Ekadasi, and there's cornstarch in the icing sugar that goes into Simply Wonderfuls. And Prabhupada, he said something like, we are not fanatics. And everybody, took their Simply Wonderfuls.
And it was in the middle of the night when His Divine Grace arrived, and we were all lined up to meet him. But the most amazing thing was that when he arrived, he was golden. He was just golden. And you could hear the devotees, as Prabhupada was walking by, you could hear one devotee after another. They were like gasping and, in surprise. He's golden, but he's golden. He's golden. And it really was. Prabhupada just appeared on this specific occasion. It was different than other times. Prabhupada's always transcendental and effulgent, but this particular time he was looking like a walking deity or something. He was just looking very golden.
When I was in LA, I know Prabhupada had wanted us to carve some murtis of Radha Krishna. This is before we had installed any deities, and he was at the time trying to cast them in America to see if it could be facilitated. So he had Subal carve out a rough form of Radha Krishna, and then he asked Subal and myself to go to different foundries, all over, and we were very inexperienced. I didn't even know the right things to ask, so we'd go and we'd see Prabhupada, and he'd say, so what intelligent information do you have for me today? Because we usually taught him some nonsense. So then Prabhupada left and went to San Francisco, and then a while later when he came back to San Francisco, he might have gone to India again, he wrote me a letter saying that he wanted to know what was happening with those murtis that we carved, and we should make sure he gets them, Eventually he decided that they should be cast in India.
There was a program also that he had of a deity walk, where we would take the deities on Sunday and walk all around the whole block with the small deities, and we were asked to go into the houses in the early morning and ask people if we could take a flower from their garden, and then we would bring the deities around the back down the laneway and past his window. And he would stand up. I remember we'd all look forward to that. And he would look out of his window when he heard the kirtan coming. And we would all stand there for some time, jumping up and down, so happy to see him. And then we would go around, bring the deities to the front, and outside the temple, we would place the deities, and then each one of us would give a report. And this was quite shocking for me because I was such a new devotee, but you'd have to walk up in front of the deities with your hands folded and say, my dear Lord, this is what I've done this week, and say what your service was, and so on and so forth. It was such a spontaneous kind of a mood to talk to the deities like that. At first I was a little shocked, but I grew to quite like that. And everyone in the temple would have to present themselves and say what they had done for the pleasure of the deities.
Prabhupada was fixed in his preaching mission, and that was his ecstasy. But every now and then, his internal emotions would bubble up sometimes. So usually Prabhupada would come and offer his obeisances to the three altars, and then he would come and sit on the Vyasasana, and we would offer obeisances, and we would still be in the process of bowing down, and he'd be sitting on the Vyasasana, and he would begin with the Sanskrit, Om Purnamada Purnamidam, the Sanskrit rolling out, and nothing came, there was nothing coming. So we all looked up, and Prabhupada was sitting and he was looking at the deities, and tears were just pouring down his eyes. He couldn't speak, just tears were pouring down his eyes. And it was the most far out thing, because then he pulled himself up straight, he took a deep breath, and you could tell he just suppressed, physically, just pushed it down and went on with his business. It was like Daruka, it was a disturbance to his service, But there was no question that Prabhupada was on the highest level. But he was so dedicated to his spiritual master, he would not let his personal ecstasy interrupt his service to his Guru Maharaj. And then one time Prabhupada was leaving The Vyasa-san was in the back, and there was a side door, and Prabhupada had his slippers right there. So Prabhupada went out, and he had his back to us, and he was just slipping on his slippers. I think someone was helping him slip them on. And he turned to us, and we were just sitting there with our mouths open, nobody moving. And Prabhupada said, "Yes, if I told you everything, you would faint." And then he walked up to his room.
Prabhupada invited all the other temple presidents to come and see the LA standard. And he wanted this standard to be introduced, especially with the deity worship, with the 3 altars. Prabhupada, when we got the building, Prabhupada went room to room and picked out what each room should be used for. Now, where you walk in now and there's a temple, that actually wasn't the temple that Prabhupada chose. Prabhupada had another vision that wasn't our vision. His vision was to have mainstream America come into that with their shoes on and sit in the pews and hear Bhagavad Gita and Kirtan on the stage. We put Prabhupada's Vyasasana on the stage. And he had Vishnu John play the organ. I even wanted to take out the stained glass, and Prabhupada said, "No, that must stay." He said, "Don't touch anything here." Even where the minister spoke, that was it called? A purport? Yeah. He kept that because he wanted devotees to come and speak too. It was so surreal to sit in the pew and hear Bhagavad Gita and hear Vishnu John singing Jayamadava on an organ. Even Prabhupada would play the organ. We would sit and he would play the organ. I wish there was tape recordings of that. Prabhupada saw that the American people were becoming disenchanted with their churches. He said, "Now I will enchant them with Krishna consciousness." So he thought, they're inclined to come to a church, let them come back to this church, but hear Bhagavad Gita and hear the Kirtan. I mean, Prabhupada's vision was totally, he was thinking mainstream America, not hippies. Prabhupada's vision wasn't that we all become monks. He wanted judges and politicians and doctors to come to the temple. They're not going to all become monks and shave up. But we had another vision, come to the temple and shave up. But that wasn't Prabhupada's vision.
Prabhupada used to come in from the back of the temple room because his quarters were upstairs and there was a hall he came down. And we didn't have the big Rukmini Dwarkadish then, we only had small Radha Krishna. And Prabhupada came in, and from the back of the temple room he looked and he called Shalavati over. Shalavati was the pujari. And he said, "There's tilak in Krishna's eye." And she went and she looked and she couldn't see anything, and she came back to Prabhupada and said, "No, there's tilak in Krishna's eye." And she looked and she looked and she looked, and right in the very kind was a tiny speck of tilak in Krishna's eye.
There was another moment that was very special to me. There were some devotees, I think it was Brahmachari, they came from Germany, and they were saying that the head pujari should not be a woman, Prabhupada said. And I remember short after that Prabhupada came, and I was in the deed room, I just did arti, and Prabhupada came in. He was on his own, he'd just been outside. And because the temple room door is very close to the front door, he just came in to see the deities. I was just standing there next to Prabhupada, and he turned to me and said, "Are you in charge?" And I said, "Yes, Prabhupada." And he smiled and nodded, and he said, "That's very good." And it was like Prabhupada kind of knew that I was given a hard time, but it was like a nod and a wink, like once a year when Prabhupada came. That was actually what kept me going, because otherwise it was very tough.
The room was full. The condensation was dripping as it did in those days. It was just so packed out in such a small space. It was impossible to believe how many people could fit into such a small space. But Prabhupada had finished giving his lecture, and that is Krishna consciousness. Are there any questions? And immediately an Indian lady stood up, and her question was, Swamiji, can you see God? It was like a challenging tone, and immediately Prabhupada replied, yes, you cannot. And then he looked around the room and said, Krishna is everywhere. You cannot see? And there was silence, just that she didn't know what to do. And so Prabhupada said, why you cannot see God? And she didn't know what to do. Then Prabhupada said, do you want to see Krishna? And the lady, she was getting embarrassed, and she looked down and said, no, Swamiji. And Prabhupada immediately said, therefore you cannot see.
One beautiful memory from that time, actually, it actually concerns Sudajaya, a French devotee who joined around that time when he was visiting from Paris, and this was his first meeting with Prabhupada. The temple was crowded, and he was sort of just peeping through the door. And he asked at the end of Prabhupada's lecture, he started just telling Prabhupada, he said, you know, I met the devotees here in London. I came here to get a job. But I met the devotees, and I just find they're so attractive. I just want to be around them. And now I've heard you speaking. And, you know, it's just so beautiful. It's so wonderful to be here in the temple, surrounded by all these wonderful devotees and listening to you. And I don't want to go back to find a job. I don't want to go back to Paris. I just want to stay here with all the devotees. And Prabhupada turned and he said, with a big smile, he said, that is because from crow you have become swan. And everyone just like erupted into laughter and joy and cheering, you know. It was a very nice moment.
When he got initiated, Prabhupada said, the swan.
Oh, right, the swan.
I met the devotees in very early 70s. One afternoon I saw them in Calcutta playing Mridanga, and after some time they were preaching. After that I asked them a few questions, and they told me that they have a center in Albert Road. And at the time I was a student of Calcutta University, and I decided to go there. I also heard through the grapevine that at that time Srila Prabhupada is in town. So I bought some fruits, and I showed up to see Srila Prabhupada one evening, because also I heard that he gives darshan. And I was met at the gate of 3C Albert Road by Shama Sundara Prabhu. And he just told me to wait for a second. He went in to talk with Prabhupada, and he came and asked me if I am a student. And I said, yes, I am a student of Calcutta University. And he said, go ahead, go in. And I went, and there was Prabhupada alone, and there was nobody else. So I bowed down before him, because in India it's a custom to bow down before holy men. And I offered him the bananas that I purchased, and then we started talking. And at that time, I did not have any idea of the greatness of my Gurudev. He was very open to me. He was glowing. I remembered that. He was a glowing sannyasi. And that was my first meeting with my Gurudev. And we talked a lot of things. And then when I was ready to leave, he took a banana and cut a piece of it and gave it back to me as prasadam, which I very gratefully accepted. And deep inside, I have a very good feeling that he is a genuine Swami, which is very rare in India. And after that, there was a program in a rich man's home where a lot of devotees had gathered before a Pandal program. And Prabhupada saw me in the crowd, and he held up his hand and pointed towards me and said in Bengali, "Tumi matha nara korbe kabe." The translation of that is, when would you shave your head? In other words, he was telling me, when would you become my disciple? And I was simply elated. I felt my eternal Gurudev has found me, a lost soul wandering through the universe, and my Gurudev has finally found me. It's the beginning of my journey back home.
The Pandal program was scheduled to begin, but some of the work was still going on. Now, at this time in northern Calcutta, there was some bombing and shooting going on between the Naxalites, the communists, and other people. And we had some chairs for life members in case some people didn't want to sit on the ground. There were some seats, 1 rupee each. So this was the basis for the Naxalites to complain. So they're complaining. Meanwhile, there's a gentleman named Colonel Dutta who used to come to the Calcutta temple. And he wore this pith helmet, this like African hat that was very flamboyant. So he wanted to fight all the Naxalites, and I said, no, that's not a good idea. But he was barring the entrance, and they were going back and forth, and you could hear a lot of commotion. Meanwhile, Prabhupada's up on the stage, and Prabhupada wanted to know what all the commotion was. Meanwhile, a note then came and said, quit or die, quit India or die. Prabhupada sees it, and he said, let's go, let's start the Pandal. He sang the Brahma Samhita prayers. And he's told me also, he said, go and tell them that if they want to sit in the 1 rupee chairs, that they can. Just invite them to sit. So I invited them to sit. This diffused their argument. Prabhupada started singing the Brahma Samhita prayers, Chintamani Prakara Sadmanaso, and they just quieted down. And the Pandal program started.
Before the Pandal program began, some reporters came to interview Srila Prabhupada, and one of them challenged, what is the point of spending so much money, making so many arrangements for this Pandal, when the money could be used for better purposes, to feed people? Srila Prabhupada replied, the purpose of the Pandal is simply to give people a chance to come and hear. Where has the Pandal come from? I went to America, and I simply gave people a chance to hear. And because they heard, now they have come with me to India, and they've made the Pandal.
His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, is reaching now from Calcutta to the New Delhi airport for attending the 9 days discourse of Srimad Bhagavatam. All the extended guests are welcoming him, including the Mayor of Delhi, Hansraj Gupta, MLA of Delhi State, member of our ad hoc committee, who will arrange all the discourses in New Delhi. The place is very difficult to get discourses in New Delhi, but by the arrangement with the government of India, the mayor could arrange everything perfectly.
What an appropriate event for Srila Prabhupada to be received as a very important person at the Delhi Palam Airport when he arrives for the first Delhi Pandal in Connaught Circus, and many members of the government were invited to greet Srila Prabhupada. Gurudas is the official host. Srila Prabhupada is always so much untouched by praise. He humbly receives whatever level of consciousness that his disciples have been awarded with, and receives it with such humility.
Now this is the first magazine Prabhupada is seeing printed for this occasion from Delhi called Back to God Hare in Hindi Bhagavad Darshan. And he was very pleased that our Hindi magazine is coming first time in India.
You can watch him observing people and their progress in their spiritual life. So perceptive. He was able to see externally and internally the progress of his disciples. I find that so thrilling to watch the behavior. And he seems oblivious to anything other than the bhakti, the advancement in Krishna consciousness. He gives the same message country after country, encourages each disciple. But it was very appropriate for someone who had lived and served in Delhi in the late 50s and early 60s, single-handedly alone, with no help, and just within 10 years, such a tremendous change of appreciation. Prabhupada was big news. When these pandals happened in India, in Bombay and Delhi and Calcutta, they were very widely covered, and the society of leaders were very aware of Prabhupada's presence, all the way from the Prime Minister on down through the cabinet. The Prime Minister herself was very appreciative of our Krishna Consciousness movement, and through some of the honorary members of Parliament who spoke on her behalf to her, she was helpful in the early years of our Krishna Consciousness movement, met with the devotees, and gave a good word. I was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi.
When he got back to where we were staying from the airport, he invited everyone into his room, and he was just kind of like lounging on these pillows, and he looked so youthful and effulgent. It was just totally a different experience than seeing him in America. And he was kind of like laughing and joking about how bad the milk was in Calcutta. The milk in Calcutta is finished. He'd just come from Calcutta. I was just so dumbstruck by this experience of seeing my spiritual master in this mood, this informal mood, and feeling so unworthy that I couldn't, I'd look up at him and he looked so effulgent, it hurt my eyes. I couldn't even, so I thought, okay, I'll start by looking at his feet. So I started looking at his feet, and then I moved up. It was almost like offering arti with my eyes, I kind of like moved up his transcendental body till I got to his face. And when I beheld his face, he was transformed in his appearance. And I started trembling and tears started pouring. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and it was not a physical form at all that I'd ever seen, but it was Prabhupada, but it was like transformed into this exquisite kind of otherworldly beauty that you never see on this planet, and I almost fainted. Seeing Prabhupada's appearance transform was like a tangible proof to me that he was a being from the spiritual plane, from the spiritual world, in our midst. And every once in a while, the veil would lift from our eyes and we'd get a little glimpse, by Prabhupada's mercy.
This is literally the first day of the Delhi Pandal. There's the wonderful asana. And behind those curtains are the incredibly beautiful deities of Radha Gokulananda, who were officially installed by Srila Prabhupada at this time, on the occasion of the Delhi Pandal. There was an instance for both the Pandal in Delhi, the first Bombay Pandal. Those deities went to Australia and New Zealand. These went to the manor. And in Jaipur, the Radha Govinda deities, which ultimately went to New York. Prabhupada considered that these festival programs were an installation of the deity. In other words, they were worshipped in his presence. So for a pure devotee to be introducing them to worship is naturally a form of installation. So these deities, there were different pastimes in these three places of London and New York and Dallas, where devotees actually made some adjustment on the Archa Vigraha in some small way And when Prabhupada heard that, he said, no, these deities have already been worshipped. This should not take place. So it so happened that I was the person that was arranging for their worship and installation on that aspect of the pandal. And shortly after the end of that program, I literally fell unconscious into a coma for 3 days.
One evening, an American young man or hooligan came forward to the stage. You know, he was bare-chested with a leather vest. He had tattoos all over his body. He had chains hanging from his neck, and he had wild long hair. And he came up to the stage in a very aggressive mood. He wanted to challenge Srila Prabhupada. So immediately Prabhupada's disciples rushed forward to keep him away. But Srila Prabhupada surprised us all and said, no, let him come on the stage. So Prabhupada had him come on the stage. He had the disciples give him a cushion or asan to sit in. And Prabhupada had the disciples put a microphone in front of him. He said, have you realized yourself within yourself? And Srila Prabhupada said, yes. Then the young man was sort of taken aback. And he said, how old is the Bhagavad Gita? Srila Prabhupada said, 5,000 years. Then the young man began to spout, no, according to my authorities, according to my information, Bhagavad Gita is only about 1,000 years old. And Prabhupada said, that's nonsense. Then the young man asked another challenging question, and Prabhupada finally said, no, you answer my question now. What is the process for learning Bhagavad Gita? And the young man said, no, I asked you first. You answer my question first. And Prabhupada retorted, no, I'm not your servant. I don't have to answer your question. You answer my question. What is the process for learning Bhagavad Gita? So eventually, the two were shouting at each other, and Prabhupada motioned, and the disciples escorted the man from the stage. And then Srila Prabhupada proceeded to explain what the process for receiving the knowledge of Bhagavad Gita is, and that is submissive oral reception, not by challenging. Now, I was in the audience distributing books at the time, and the incident created pandemonium in the audience, and the whole audience was polarized, some in favor of Prabhupada and some in favor of the young man. The ones that were sympathetic to the young man got up and surrounded us and started to challenge us and say, you know, your Guru Maharaj should have answered his question. So the mood was so agitated that all of us that were distributing in the audience sort of made our way as quickly as possible back to the area of the stage. But later we realized what Prabhupada had done. He had created a situation to illustrate how one is unable to learn Bhagavad Gita. And in contrast, Srila Prabhupada explained what the real process is, and that is by submissive hearing from the authority.
My job, one of them was to invite chief guests to the program, and so I thought it would be a good idea to, because we did this in London, have titles for what Prabhupada would talk about, and have guests that would sometimes have something to do with the theme. One of the chief guests was James George, the Canadian ambassador to India, who was very favorable. I think his talk was appreciated by the populace as well as any of the chief guests, if not more. So we invited Dr. Atmaram, the chief scientist, and he talked on how religion and science actually don't have to be at odds with each other. And then Prabhupada spoke on, like Easy Journey to Other Planets type of a scientific talk. So we invited Hans Raj Gupta, the mayor of Delhi, who was a really good friend of Prabhupada. It was more anecdotal, how Prabhupada continued and persevered and started the League of Devotees and printed the Srimad Bhagavatams. It was very enlightening to us because Prabhupada really did persevere at the beginning of many of the things that we take for granted and made them happen.
This is the first expansion of Srila Prabhupada's energy that has become the Glory of India project today. Srila Prabhupada, when he left for the West, knew he was going to come back and inundate India with Krishna consciousness, just the way Lord Chaitanya inundated the subcontinent of India with Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada's destiny was to do that. And when he brought his disciples back from the West, who were enthusiastic but very new disciples, he started sending them various places for preaching work. So Delhi, Calcutta, and Bombay were the first three big cities that Srila Prabhupada worked on. And because this was the capital, it was important. We were only there for maybe a month, but that month seems like it could have been 100 years. It was so important at the time. So these were just the very little beginning foundation blocks of what later became the Delhi ISKCON Temple project.